our last clip, we discussed how Crockett, after moving to Lawrence County, got involved in politics on a local scale. Now, having tasted the stew of politics, he decided he wanted a bigger spoonful, and he surprised his friends and constituents when he announced his candidacy for the Tennessee state legislature, which, interestingly enough, he won his first bid for election. But Crockett had been at the first session of the 14th General Assembly for no more than 12 days before he received devastating news from home, which let him know that Shoal Creek had flooded and wiped out his powder mill and his grist mill. So he requested a leave of absence and headed on home, expecting the worst. And when he got there and saw the devastation that the flood had brought, his fears were confirmed. But other fears that he had along the trip back home were put to rest, because he found much to his delight that Elizabeth had taken the children and moved to safety with other family living nearby. Now Crockett was left holding the bag, and he knew that he would have to not only restore normalcy to the family, but also take care of the debts. However, political life had to come first. He had responsibilities that he had to take care of up in Murfreesboro. So he went back in October and served out the remainder of his term, leaving for home on November 17th. Now when he gets back home, he decides that he needs to move his family elsewhere, and he decides to attempt to do so by moving to newly opened lands in Carroll County. But of course, he doesn't really have the money or any kind of grant to get this land to settle down on. But fortunately, his father-in-law, Robert Patton, intervened because he had received a land grant from the North Carolinian government for 1,000 acres of land, 800 of which he gifted to David Crockett after hearing about the misfortune that had befallen them. And Crockett agreed upon this and agreed to pay Mr. Patton back the $1,600 that was owed for this land. But of course he still had other debts to pay off, and so he sold off those 800 acres and decided to live on the remaining 200 that belonged to Robert. Now, at this point, Crockett is getting along fairly tolerably. He's paying off his debts as best he can, he's enjoying getting back into civilian life and going out into the woods hunting bear. But a fluke article from the Jackson Gazette would force Crockett out of retirement, wherein he got back into the Tennessee state legislature for a second term. But although he spent out his term there faithfully, advocating for the rights of the squatters and poor, he figured that he would be much better suited and could do much more on a bigger stage. And so he decides to announce his candidacy for Congress. But in 1825, unfortunately, he was beat out by his opponent, Adam Alexander. But Crockett was not one to bemoan his plight, and involved himself in the business of pipe stave making, which, of course, he nearly lost his life in this venture. But interestingly enough, although he had nearly lost his life and had lost his boats, as well as all the staves, he actually gained a friend who would help him out big time. And that was the mayor of Memphis, Marcus Winchester, who endorsed Crockett's running for office and, in fact, helped him financially for his campaign. And sure enough, this worked out beyond a shadow of a doubt, because in August of 1827, Crockett not only beat out William Arnold, but defeated his old opponent, Adam Alexander. Crockett was finally going to Congress. Now, when Crockett got to Washington, D.C. and set himself up at Miss Ball's rooming house on Pennsylvania Avenue, he was fairly optimistic about what being in Congress would bring. But very quickly realism began to set in, and he started to find that it was a tedious task just to stay awake and listen to all of the speeches that were going on throughout the day. But perhaps the most notable event that took place in Crockett's time in Congress would come during his second term of election between the years 1829 to 1831. We'll have to talk about that in another clip, but please continue to follow along as we talk about Crockett going to Congress.